Okay, good morning and good afternoon to others.
Good afternoon,
So,
Alex.
good afternoon. So it's nice to see some familiar faces on the webinar, and I can see some from across the country as well. So that's fantastic. I'm gonna give it one more minute just to allow more people to come, and then I'll get started.
I believe you're the instructor, right?
Yes, I will be the instructor for today.
All right, cool. I'm gonna have to call some of my coworkers. They're still on lunch. They forgot about it, I bet.
So the meeting will be recorded, and it'll be distributed to everyone on the call as well. So if they do miss it, we can forward that to your team. But why don't I get started, and then as people trickle in, we'll get past the introduction. So for those of you I have not met, my name is Alexander Taillon. I am the Radon Technical Manager in the GTA and the National Practice Leader for our Radon service lines at Pinchin. So before we dive too deep into the topic, a quick word about who we are. So Pinchin is a national environmental and engineering consulting firm with offices across Canada. We work with property owners, developers, employers, and government clients across a wide range of service areas, ranging from hazardous building materials, occupational health and safety, environmental due diligence, and we have a sizable building science and engineering team as well, just to name a few of the groups. And then there's the team that I am part of. So indoor environmental quality. We focus on the health and safety conditions inside buildings, things like air quality, mold, and the subject of today's session, radon. So across all these disciplines, what connects our work is the same goal. We're here to help our clients understand the risk, meet their obligations, and make confident decisions. And that's exactly what we're here to talk to you about today. So I've been at Pinchin for approximately 8 years now, and I've been working on radon measurement, mitigation, and construction jobs ever since. I have a background in mechanical engineering. I am a certified measurement and mitigation professional under the CNRPP, and I sit on the board of directors of CARST, that is the Canadian Association of Radon Scientists and Technologists, which is a non-for-profit association committed to raising awareness, facilitating training and education, and upholding the highest standards in the radon industry. So today we're here to talk about the regulatory changes that directly affects every federally regulated workplace in Canada, a significant reduction in the radon action level under Part 2 of the Canada. So it's important that this is not a proposal, nor is this a consultation. The regulations have been published in the Canada Gazette, and the enforcement date is January 30th, 2027. That means that employers have a defined window to take action. So over the next 45 minutes, we'll walk you through what is changing, what it means for your organization, and what you are required to do, and then how Pinchin can help efficiently get there. So let's dive right in. Here's what we'll cover today. So we've structured the session to build from the foundational knowledge and then take us into the practical application. We start with the basics of what is radon and why it matters for our health and safety. We won't spend too much time on the topic, knowing that if you joined us today, you already know about the risks associated with it and the attention that it deserves. Then we'll move into the specific regulatory changes, your obligations under the Canada Labour Code, and then from there we'll get into the practical, what you need to do. And finally, we'll close with how Pinchin can support you through that process. So I ask that you please hold your questions until the end. You should be muted at this point. And if you do have questions at the end, please raise your hand, and then you'll be able to unmute yourself. So let's start with the basics. Radon is a naturally occurring gas. It forms from the breakdown of uranium that is present in virtually all the soil and the rock around us. On its own, radon in the outdoors disperses harmlessly. The problem is when it arises or when it enters enclosed buildings and is allowed to concentrate. It seeps in through cracks in your building foundation, utility and service entry lines, construction joints or cold joints. Once inside, it has nowhere really to go, so it builds up and occupants breathe it in over time. It has no color, no smell, no taste. You can't sense it, and the only way to know that it's present is to test. And that's exactly why the regulations around testing and the action levels matter so much. So the unit of measurement in particular is the becquerel per meter cube. This expresses radioactivity inside a volume of air. So we'll be using this unit throughout the presentation, so maybe it's important to pause here for a second and emphasize the point. A becquerel is 1 radioactive decay per second, to keep it simple. Now let's imagine a typical volume of air within a standard fridge within your home. Standard fridge is about 1 cubic meter of air within. So that means at 1 becquerel per meter cube, you have 1 disintegration per second happening within that volume of air within your fridge. If we keep going with that example and we use the new Canada Labour Code action limit of 200, that means that there are 200 atoms silently, radioactively decaying within the fridge. So I'm going to take that example one step further. Now I'm going to look at my room in front of in here, and I'm going to say it's approximately 8 meters by 6 meters by your typical height here of feet. So 0.3 or 2.7 meters. That's roughly 130 cubic meters of air. At 200 becquerels, that turns into 26,000 radioactive decays per second happening within this very room. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't hear it. It's completely invisible to all of our senses. So, some of you looking in at the room that you're in right now, holding your breath. The World Health Organization recommends that you take action to remediate when concentrations exceed 100. Health Canada recommends 200. And at the end of January of next year, the Canada Labour Code is going to reduce their action limit to follow that of Health Canada, 200 becquerels per meter cube. So here's why radon matters for our health. Radon gas accounts for half the ionizing radiation the average person is exposed to in their lifetime. Ionizing being that form of radiation that breaks down those molecular bonds, that damages the DNA. According to Stats Canada and the Canadian Cancer Society, general cancer is the leading cause of death in Canada, making up approximately 26 to 30% of all deaths. And lung cancer specifically is the second most common amongst all of them in 2026. It's approximately 3,200 Canadians that die from radon-induced lung cancer each year in Canada. That's 4 times higher than lung cancer deaths as a result of secondhand smoke, and more than car accident deaths, carbon monoxide poisoning, and household fires, all put together. So the risk associated with radon is proportional to concentration of radon that you're exposed to, as well as the time that you're exposed to. The higher the radon concentrations and the longer you're exposed to them, the greater the risk. For smokers, that risk compounds dramatically. Radon and tobacco together are far more dangerous than either of them alone. And because lung cancer takes decades to manifest and to be detected, workers exposed today might not feel the effects for many years. And this is precisely why regulation limits are being tightened to protect the long-term health before the damage becomes irreversible. So before we talk about what is changing, let's understand where things stand today. The Canada Labour Code is primarily the occupational health and safety legislation for federally regulated employers. Under the Canada Occupational Health and Safety regs, the current radon action limit is 800 becquerels per meter cubed. That number has been in place for a very long time. Back in October of 2023, so a bit more than 3 years ago now, a proposed version of these changes, sorry, just under 3 years, so 2.5 years, but a proposed version of these changes was published in the Canada Gazette Part 1 for public consultation. It underwent a 30-day review period where stakeholders and members of the public, like you and I, were able to make comments on these changes. And since that time, the government has been reviewing those comments, responding to people who have made those comments, as well as finalizing the regs. The Canada Gazette, for background, is the official newspaper of the Government of Canada. It is legally recognized as the way the federal government announces proposed and finalized regs, as well as public notices and official appointments. If a federal regulation is not published in the Gazette, then it doesn't have any legal force. The changes we're talking about today have been in discussion for well over 10 years, longer than I've been in this industry. The glaring inconsistencies between 800 for federal workplaces versus 200 for public buildings and homes has long been recognized. The federal government is now taking that action to close the gap between them. So they recognize that since then there has been a large amount of information, studies, and research that demonstrate the clear linear relationship between lung cancer, radon-induced lung cancer. Furthermore, it also recognizes that other jurisdictions around the world, like Australia, China, the UK, and other countries in the EU, have set their radon exposure levels much lower. So Canada was an outlier. So before we dive too deep into the changes, here's the primary source. And what I'll do is I'll also put it in the chat at the end of the meeting. And this is for some of you that are interested in some light reading tonight, or maybe some of you that are in need of briefing your legal or HR teams. But the regulation was published in the Canada Gazette Part 2, February 11th of this year. The title of that amendment is up there on the screen. So although the changes we're here to discuss are specific to the Canada Occupational Health and Safety regs, it's important to also note that it's not the only one. That document is onerous, and it does include changes to other materials such as nanomaterials, thermal stresses, National Fire Code, name a few. And it affects other regs, not just the Canada Occupational Health and Safety regs. But what we'll focus on specifically for this presentation is just the radon specific changes. So the centralized fact of this presentation today, and why most of you are here, the federal action level for the Canada Labour Code has been reduced from 800 to 200. The new limit aligns specifically with Health Canada's guidance, bringing the federally regulated workplaces in line with what is expected of public and residential buildings. But what's more than that? It's not just the action limit, and that's why this topic is so important. So let's take a look at the language around these action levels. Most notably is the shift from shall be exposed to must ensure. This simple change has large impacts. It takes the conversation away from do not let that occur to one must take the necessary steps to ensure that it doesn't. Where one had previously assumed compliance, now one must demonstrate compliance. So let's think about how asbestos is managed in federal buildings now. The regulations don't simply say an employee shall not be harmed by asbestos. No, it requires the employer to have documented asbestos management plans, a survey on file, a record of where those materials are located, worker notifications, and a maintenance log to demonstrate that they're monitoring the conditions of those materials over time. An inspector walking in today can't simply hand them a clean air sample and say, see, no one was harmed. So the new radon language works in a similar way. A radon measurement below 200 becquerels is a result. It's the employer's job to ensure that result. And ensuring means having records, that documentation. And if you have a large portfolio of buildings, it may include a program so that you can actively manage radon within compliance. And the important part to communicate is that the compliance is not as simple as just having a result. Get into the documentation in a later slide. The second important shift is the language from no employee shall be exposed to the employer must ensure. Previously, no employee was not specific enough, and there's been some ambiguity in the past with responsibilities. From my experience, I've witnessed federally regulated employer leasing a space argue that it was the obligation of the property manager, and vice versa. And now with this change, the employer is specifically the duty holder. There's no ambiguity. The exposure, if exposure occurs, it is the responsibility of the employer. If the federally regulated employer leases a space in a building, they must proactively engage their property manager and work with them at compliance. So although the employer is explicitly the duty holder with this new language, what does it mean for a property manager? The federally regulated employer is occupying a building which is owned by the province, municipality, or private entity, then the code still applies. If the entire building is occupied by the federal employer, then the entire building is subject to these changes. Should only a portion of the building be occupied by a federal employer, then only a portion of that building is affected by these changes. Now, radon doesn't respect floor plans or lease boundaries for that matter. It enters through the foundation and it distributes throughout the building. So the testing information from a tenant-specific workplace might paint a completely different picture than the radon in the entire building. So for example, if a tenant tests their space on the third floor, it might demonstrate low radon results, but it's not representative of the entire building. It still can mean that the occupants of the lower part of that building might be exposed to high radon concentrations. It's for this reason that the Health Canada guidelines specifically recommend that a building be tested in its entirety to paint a full. In any case, it suggests that a federal employer work with the property manager to reach an arrangement to ensure compliance. In some cases, the duty holder may also include the property manager. Each case is unique, and it's worth reviewing independently. This is because each circumstances might have its own lease agreement in place between both parties. And the contract should include within it duties and responsibilities for those parties. So, unfortunately, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak much on the topic other to say that it is the responsibility of both parties to come together, to work together in order to demonstrate compliance. Pinchin, having worked on both sides of the table, can help. We can help employers navigate the conversation with their landlords, or we can help the property managers understand exactly what those federal tenants. So looking at the measurement guidance quickly here, during the 30-day review period back in 2023, when these changes were first announced in Gazette Part 1, there were numerous questions raised, and it's worth bringing up one of those questions now. The question went to the heart of what employers are asking right now, which is, where do I go for guidance on how to test, what equipment to use, and who should be doing the testing? The government answers that question in these changes or in this document. They state that the government of Canada provides clear guidance on radon testing, shown here on the right, including lists of certified testing products and certified professionals through Health Canada and specifically through the CNRPP, or the Canadian National Radon Proficiency Program. The answer is quite specific, and the government doesn't say do any test. They point directly to a specific certification program that defines what qualified looks like for both the devices that are used and the personnel doing the test. The CNRPP is the Canadian National Standard for the Radon Measurement and Mitigation Professionals. It's a third-party certification program. It's recognized by Health Canada. It requires that professionals demonstrate technical competencies, use approved testing protocols, and maintain ongoing education to keep their certification current. Let's take a look at timelines a little bit. So the regulation was registered on January 30th, 2026, and it was published February 11th, just a few weeks later. Due to the concern of employers, the labor program has since extended the coming to force date to the first anniversary of the date on which it was registered, January 30th, 2027. For those with buildings that still need to be tested, it's not a lot of time. Here's the part that catches most employers off guard. The radon testing must be completed over a minimum of 91 days. That's 3 months minimum. And those tests need to be completed during the heating season. That is October to April. Both Health Canada and the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regs, I'm going to say that a lot in this presentation, recognize this. For the result to be truly representative of occupant exposure and to be defensible under the new employer duties, you want your tests to be a minimum of 91 days. They must overlap the heating season substantially. So this is why October to April is that target testing window. It means that we should not be deploying detectors past January. Otherwise the 91-day testing period is going to take us outside of that heating season. So the true window to deploy detectors is from October 1st to end of January. That doesn't leave us a lot of time to test, right? In all honesty, we haven't talked about radon mitigation either. So if radon concentrations come back above the action limit, 91 days from October already takes us into January. So if you find high radon concentration within your buildings, your time is particularly short. Now, since the announcement of these back in 2023, I've been working with a number of federally regulated clients in preparation for what's to come. I've also been in contact with Labor Program Canada to follow up on discussions and interpretation of these changes. If you are an employer sitting on a large portfolio of untested buildings, know that you're not alone. The Labor Program has acknowledged that it might be difficult for employers with a large untested portfolio of buildings to realistically complete their long-term testing across the entire portfolio by the deadline. especially if they haven't commenced yet. So a phased approach where you test the highest risk buildings first with documentation and a plan for the remainder might be a recognized plan forward, provided that it's discussed and agreed upon with the regulator. And that's the key, discussed and agreed upon with labor program. The flexibility in itself is not automatic. The labor program also acknowledges that these changes have been announced for over 2 years. So although it's available, it's not guaranteed. Employers must reach out, they must explain their situation and demonstrate that they have a plan. The difference between an employer who's working towards compliance and one who is non-compliance often comes down to one thing, the documentation of intent. So a phase testing program with for example, a written prioritization, testing schedule, evidence of ongoing testing. That's the fundamentals. That's what we're talking about here. So let's take a step back. It's worth talking about who this applies to, what these changes or who these changes apply to. Most health and safety legislation in Canada is provincial. Every province has their own. The Canada Labor Code is different. It doesn't apply based on where you're located. It applies based on the nature of your business. So a Canada branch, or sorry, a bank branch in Saskatchewan, for instance, would follow the Canada Labor Code. A bell technician working in New Brunswick would also follow the Canada Labor Code. Province doesn't matter. It's the nature of that business. That's everything. So who does that include? Well, the obvious are the federal departments, the agencies, the crown corporations, the Canada Post, the CBC, the Export Development Canada. But federally regulated private sector is just as large. Every chartered bank in Canada, federal. Telecommunication companies, that's Bell, that's TELUS, that's Rogers, federal. Air transportation, railways, road transportation services like the interprovincial trucking, busing, uranium mining, processing, grain handling, all federal. In principle, if a service is crossing a provincial or an international border, it's federal. Collectively, we're talking about some of the largest employers in Canada. It's tens of thousands of workplaces and hundreds of thousands of workers. If there's any uncertainty as to if your organization falls under the Canada Labor Code, then check with the Government of Canada site. I put the link there at the bottom as well. Put it into the chat. Jody, I see your question there. Are municipal government buildings included in this? So municipalities are under the province, as far as I'm aware. But again, if there's any uncertainty, I would urge you to have a look at that list. It's on the Government of Canada website, or verify that with your insurer. So what changes for employers? The most immediate change is the action level itself, from 800 to 200 becquerels per meter cubed. The number is significant, but it's not the only thing, right? We've talked about the responsibilities of the employer and the language that changes from shall to must insure. So let's stick with that for a moment longer. The shift in how that compliance is expected to be demonstrated is what truly changed. The obligation to assess radon in federally regulated workplaces is not new. It's always been there. It's existed under the previous framework. Employers were always expected to demonstrate whether radon was a concern in their buildings and for their employees, and to take action if it was. The difference what we're seeing here is that language of what take action looks like in practice. Under the old framework, and let's be honest about how it played out in the real world, but some employers were reactive. Someone raises a concern, maybe it was a worker complaint, or maybe there was a radon news story in the press. The employer orders a test, the results come back, they were below 800, and the case was closed. Under these new changes, the employer must ensure that no employee is exposed. So how does an employer ensure compliance if they've not measured it? And how does one ensure compliance if you're acting reactively? In summary, ensuring compliance with the action level of 200 means knowing what your buildings are at. And the only way to know that is to test the radon. The question I've heard all too often in my years here at Pinchin is whether testing is required. Well, the new language changes that. And the old question no longer has a leg to stand on. To ensure compliance, one must demonstrate that testing has been completed. In all honesty, the testing requirement shouldn't be the biggest takeaway from this conversation. It's the demonstration, it's the documentation, it's the record keeping. And it should be necessary for some larger portfolios or not larger portfolio managers. It might mean a radon management program. So to discuss record keeping a bit here. The record keeping is one of those subtle changes that you will notice within these changes, in these latest Gazette changes here. They've tried to standardize record keeping across the Canada Labor Code. Admittedly, it largely remains the same in the Canada Occupational Health and Safety regs for the purposes of our conversation. But in summary, what it says is that an employer must keep record for a period of 30 years. And I bring this up because, again, according to the Canadian Occupational Health and Safety regs, every employer shall keep record of all hazardous substances. Now that's extremely broad. But if we keep going, section 10.4 goes on to identify radon exposure as one of those such hazards. But why is that important to you? Well, we know that radon exposure can cause lung cancer. And we know that the risk associated with developing lung cancer is correlated to duration of exposure, as well as the concentration. Finally, we know that lung cancer can appear or be detected decades after the exposure. So a worker sitting in your office today could be diagnosed with radon-induced lung cancer in 2050. At that point, your records from 2026 are what stand between your organization and a very difficult conversation with that employee. So this is why documentation is so important. And it's not just to satisfy an inspection, but to protect your organization across generations of potential liability. So beyond just record keeping, let's talk about the quality of the records. Let's break this down into two components, the qualified person and the content of the records. So again, according to section 10.4, if an employee's health or safety is at risk, then the employer must appoint a qualified person to investigate. In practice, one of the surest ways to meet that obligation is to engage a professional recognized by the federal government and Health Canada, which is a CNRPP. The content, on the other hand, at minimum, your documentation should clearly capture, and this is from section 10.19 of the regs. It should capture the date, the time, the location of the samples themselves, and the methods that they were used to analyze them. the laboratory in question, the duration of the test, the limitations of those tests, what were the results, what were the recommendations. So, key takeaways. An employer who conducts the proper testing ensures that it's done correctly and maintains those records at a far stronger position 20, 25 years down the road than someone who's never tested, or an employer who's tested incorrectly, or one who has tested and can't produce those defensible documentation. Because at the end of the day, the compliance that we're talking about is not just the work, it's about being able to prove that you've done the work. So building a radon management program, let's start with the simple. If you've managed a simple if you're managing a single federally regulated building, what does compliance look like? Test, document where the detectors have gone and where, you record your results, you notify the workers, and you keep those records for 30 years. That's it. It's a process. It's not a program. It's straightforward to execute, and it's straightforward to demonstrate to an inspector. The goal in this particular case is when a health and safety officer walks in, you can open up a folder and you can guide them through the process. Folder is your compliance. That test and your documentation is the test or your compliance. But now imagine that you manage 50 buildings, 100 buildings, or 1,000 buildings, which, as we've discussed, is a real scenario for some of you on the call. Suddenly, opening up a folder isn't quite as easy. Which buildings are we talking about? How many buildings? Which ones have been tested and when? What are those results and what are the recommendations? Who owns the documents? Where are they stored? Further to the risk of, with the risk of more buildings comes the risk of elevated radon concentrations or exceedances. So now we're talking about which buildings have been remediated. The process is followed. Is there a proper monitoring program and retesting occurring regularly? And then the most important question for a large portfolio is who within your organization is monitoring that? Are all the key stakeholders being informed of any changes within your buildings? For example, if there's a change in occupancy, ownership, renovations, retesting might be required. And in some cases, it might open you up to risk of non-compliance. If you have an active radon mitigation system within some of your buildings, are systems being inspected routinely? Are those buildings being retested? At scale, monitoring and managing large portfolios can be onerous. What helps is a radon management program, something that establishes ownership, responsibilities within the organization, processes, and communication plans. It's not a complicated thing, but it is a specific thing. It means having a written policy that establishes radon as a managed hazard within your portfolio. It means a centralized inventory of all your buildings associated with risk, testing schedules that are built around which buildings are to be tested, which ones have been tested already, what are those results, and do they hit the threshold? In other words, it looks very simple on how it looks very similar to how a well-run asbestos management program looks like. Those who've been through an asbestos audit will recognize the structure. The logic is similar. You have a hazard, it's present in your buildings. The job is to know where it is, to manage it. So here's a question for, if a federal health and safety officer called your office tomorrow and asked, can you tell me the status of your buildings, all your buildings in your portfolio? What would the answer be? If you manage a handful of buildings, you've done the testing already, the answer might be yes. If you manage dozens or hundreds of buildings, you haven't completed the testing program, then maybe your answer is no. And that's where the gap is that we need to close. Deadline. For small portfolios, the goal can be documentation. For large portfolios, the goal should be a program. Both serve the same purposes. They both have the ability to demonstrate at any moment that you are actively ensuring the key to actively ensure that your workers are not exposed to concentrations above the action. We'll jump into how Pinchin can. What Pinchin offers is a complete end-to-end radon compliance program designed specifically for the complexities of a large portfolio, and in this case, the particular demands of a federally regulated. It starts with prioritization. Before you spend $1 on testing, it should help you understand which buildings in your portfolio carry the highest risk. So your resources go to exactly where it matters first. And then we can create a defensible, risk-based approach to managing your portfolio. From there, we deploy and we retrieve the long-term detectors using approved Health Canada equipment managed by CNRPP. When it comes to reporting, this is where the work is genuinely important. They're written to support the regulatory compliance with clear results, clear recommendations. What are your next steps for health and safety teams? Where mitigation is required, we meet you where you need us. Our team can handle the design and engineering of the mitigation systems. We can certainly tender out to qualified contractors, and we can carry those contractors as acting as the general contractor as well. Or you can provide that third-party oversight if you have designated professionals. Critically, and after mitigation, we can't just assume that the problem is solved. We go in there, we verify through additional testing that concentrations have been reduced. We demonstrate that the solution is in effect, providing you those defensible results to demonstrate compliance. And finally, tying everything back to what we've been talking about today, we help you build and document that compliance program itself. Procedures, the records, the communication templates, the framework to demonstrate to an inspector, or to your employees, or to health and safety teams within your organization that it's been done right. Testing tells you where you stand on a given day. Program is what carries you through to the next 30 years. So, what sets Pinchin apart? First, the technical credibility. So our radon professionals hold CNRPP certification. That's the recognized national standard for radon measurement and mitigation in Canada. Most direct way to meet the code definition of what a qualified person is. We don't just have a few. We currently have about 30 to 35 across the country. That's more than any other firm in Canada. And that depth matters because we can mobilize qualified people where you need them, when you need them, without bottlenecking the program. Second is the national reach. So we've got local expertise across 40 offices in Canada. Radon specialists who understand local radon landscape and the local regulatory expectations. So whether your workplaces are in the GTA, Montreal, Calgary, it's a coordinated program, delivered locally but managed nationally. Third, our deliverables are built for regulatory readiness. Our reports are structured specifically to satisfy those. And fourth, we stay with you throughout the process, program development right to final compliance. are there to assist throughout the process. And as many of you already know, Radon is just one of those services that we provide. We're a full service environmental and engineering consulting. So the same team that helps you with your radon support can also help you with your asbestos, your air quality, or occupational health and safety, a wide range of other services. One relationship, one trusted partner. The bottom line is that whether it's 5 buildings or 500, we're here. So before we conclude, let's talk, or let's be direct about what's at stake here, because this is part of the conversation some are focused on. Regulatory enforcement is real. The labor program has the authority to inspect and audit federally regulated workplace, issue compliance orders, levy penalties. It's not a minor administrative issue. The Canada Labor Code does have teeth. Beyond enforcement is the reputational risk. So workers have the rights to file complaints, and they don't have to go to the employer first. A complaint can go straight to the labor program. It can trigger an inspection. It can become part of public record. And then there's the third and the most serious of all is the worker health. So employers who fail to test or knowingly allow high radon concentrations above the have or may face liabilities if the worker were to later develop radon-induced cancer. So remember that timeline that we discussed. This is a disease that can take time, decades to appear. And cost. Cost is often a component, so I'll take a moment to discuss for a minute. The cost of testing itself is quite small. Cost of mitigation, where it's needed, can be modest, depending on the building. Cost of enforcement, litigation of reputational damage, that can be substantial. In a serious health claim, it could be enormous. So you're not choosing to spend money saving money. You're choosing between small predictable cost now versus a large unpredictable cost later. The bottom line with the risk is that inaction is not a neutral choice. And I think that's the point of it is that it's a decision. And under the new framework, it's a decision that carries risk. The safest choice for your workers, for your organization, for your bottom line is to act, to test. We're coming up on time, and this is a few takeaways. So let's discuss just the 5 key takeaways from the presentation. The action limit or the action level under the Canada Labor Code is falling from 800 to 200, effective end of January of next year. Not a proposal, it's published, it's finalized regs. A workplace that was compliant under the old limit might now be 4 times over on the new one. The new language, and second, the new language makes clear that the employer is the named duty holder, requires them to ensure compliance, active, ongoing. One cannot ensure compliance if they're not active. One cannot ensure compliance if they are active reactively. Third, radon is a named hazard under the Canada Occupational Health and Safety Regs. The record must be kept for 30 years. Because radon-induced lung cancer can take decades to appear, the records are what is protecting you. The enforcement date takes effect at the end of January 2027. With long-term testing requiring a minimum of 91 days, that leaves us very limited time to start testing. And finally, fifth, from site prioritization, testing, reporting, mitigation, full program documentation, Pinchin can be your partner. As a final slide, I've included next steps. Your next steps may include to confirm your jurisdiction, inventory of buildings, evaluate high-risk properties and prioritize them, engage a qualified partner to complete testing and mitigation. Then conduct the testing, interpret the results, mitigate, monitor, finally build and document your program of your testing. My contact information is at the bottom of the slide. You can reach out to me directly, but we've got another 10 minutes, so I'm happy to answer any questions. Hi, Pamela. I see your hand is raised.
Thanks
can
very
unmute.
much.
You're welcome.
Right, can you hear me now?
I can hear you just great.
Excellent. Thanks so much for the presentation. That was great and very informative. One question I had, and sorry, I missed the first few minutes, but what are some of the things to keep in mind when you're trying to evaluate high-risk properties? How do you determine if they're high risk or not? Is there some key things we are to consider?
Right, so when we evaluate risk, there's a number of components that we take into consideration. Occupancy of the building be one. In terms of geography of those buildings can be another. So there are geological factors that may contribute to high radon emissions. The age of the building, for instance, or the manner of construction, the location or the occupant exposure within those buildings, whether they be in a basement or if they're on the 10th floor, can also be a contributing factor to risk. So when we evaluate risk and when we examine a portfolio of buildings, we look at all of those criteria to add a weighted value to some of those components. From there, we can properly identify which buildings are at the highest risk. Focus on those first.
Great, thanks very much.
Tamara, you're still on mute. You'll have
Yes, sorry. First and foremost, this was so interesting. I loved every minute of it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation. I had a quick question. In an apartment building, is there a specific, what would be the best place to put a radon monitor? If a tenant is curious if there's exposure or possible risk of radon. Would it be near a specific appliances or near a window? I know it's hard to say.
So we're talking about a multi-story or a multi-tenant
Yeah,
apartment
multi-tenant.
buildings, and you
Yeah,
are the
and
property manager.
let's say.
So okay, let's say.
I was just gonna add, it's not a high rise. It's a small building up to four levels, for example, about 10 tenants per floor.
So we would consider that building a public building according to the Health Canada guidelines.
Okay.
It would be recommended to test the entire building.
Oh, okay.
For radon. You do so by following that guidance, which specifically stipulates that you would test the lowest occupied floors of those units. So if there are occupied basements, we would start with that and work our way up in order to capture the entire footprint of a building. As a property manager, it's important that you demonstrate that you've captured the entire building and not specifically just a unit.
Okay.
Like I suggested in the slides, oftentimes testing a particular area of the building might not paint a full picture as to the radon concentrations that you have within that building. It give you a false high, not a false high, but a false sense of security, or the other way around.
Okay. So if if I have a radon detector in my unit, it could give us just a false sense of security. That doesn't mean the measurement is necessarily good because
What
it's
I
not
mean-
the entire building.
What I mean is a false sense of security across the entire building. I'll give you an
Okay.
example here. A few years ago, we tested a school, and that school had elevated radon concentrations on one side of the school, but not the
Oh.
other. And so
Okay.
we noticed that certain classrooms were higher than others, and not just a little bit, but substantially higher. We
Okay.
tested a number of multi-residential properties, and we noticed the same thing, whether they be townhouses or multi-unit or high-rise buildings. We can notice or we can identify that radon concentrations do fluctuate from room to room or units to units. So it's important to test the entire
understand.
footprint of a building.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Justin, it's nice to see you on the call, sir.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for the presentation. It was very good. I just had a question on, I know a couple of the slides touched on retesting properties down the road for, to ensure you're still in compliance. I know you're saying the radon records need to be held for 30 years. So would that mean you basically need like new testing every 30 years? And what would you recommend as how long you should wait before you retest a building?
That's a great question. So the records need to be kept for 30 years. You're correct about that. The retesting, according to Health Canada's guidance, is required when a building undergoes significant structural changes, occupancy changes, or changes to the airflow, something that may affect the air, the movement of radon within that building. So if you've completed testing in your portfolio over the last 10 years, it is your responsibility to manage those buildings in terms of monitoring if some of those changes occurs. Is occupancy changing within your buildings? Are HVAC systems being modified or upgraded? And are areas within your building being changed in a way that airflow is now changed? If those buildings meet that particular criteria, then retesting is required in order to enable to ensure again that radon concentrations remain. Now, in terms of retesting in general, the Health Canada guidance doesn't specifically state a time frame for retesting, and the Canada Labor Code changes similarly doesn't point to a specific timeline for retesting. Our best practice at Pinchin is to recommend that testing be completed or at least reviewed at a 10-year scale. So every 10 years, understanding that buildings age, the foundation ages, it may allow for additional radon entry points. Your HVAC systems as well age, become less efficient, and it may change the dynamics of your building. So as a best practice, we tell our clients 10 years. The guidance and the labor code specifically don't point to a specific time.
Thanks, Alex.
So we are at time. So if any of you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is there. Each of you will receive a copy of the slides. I'd be happy to continue the conversation or address any open questions.
Alex, there's a few questions for you in the chat. You did answer
Oh.
mine, thank you.
Sorry. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. So is the federal focus more so on getting buildings tested for the first time? Has there been any discussion about retesting in 5 years or so? Is retesting required? as part of the monitoring program. So I think
I think you
addressed
did
that in the
answer my
previous
question,
one.
Alex.
Fantastic. What about non-federally regulated employers? Does this still apply, and does it become more practice? So in terms of non-federally regulated employers, it still points to the Health Canada guidance. The recommendation there is still to test. It's recommended to test. But the language that we've specifically been talking in this slide of must ensure is not specific to the health. That's the question. So the responsibility is still for the public sector. The responsibility is to ensure that your workers are safe, that they are not exposed to unnecessary hazards in their workplace. So although the language might not be specific for public buildings or non-federally regulated buildings, the onus is still on the employer. So that duty of care is still the cite that I continue, the quote that I continue to cite. It is your responsibility as an employer to ensure the health and safety of your employees, and that does include Annette, thank you for the presentation. How often would you test if the testing results show less than 200? So another good question. Health Canada does recommend that a building be monitored if those radon concentrations are approaching 200. As best practice for Pinchin, we identify that as anywhere between 150 to 200. That building should be monitored on a regular basis. So again, thank you everyone for your time. If there are additional questions, I encourage you to reach out, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with any of you. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.